On the coldest night of winter, 7-year-old Rose Micheal found a Hell's Angel biker collapsed in the snow outside her grandmother's house. His leather jacket, adorned with the skull and wings of the notorious gang, should have sent her running, but Rose saw only a man in desperate need of help. Despite her own battle with cancer, she dragged him inside, nursing him back to life. As the biker Greenwood skullmaker regained consciousness, a promise was made, a promise that would change everything. But when his Brotherhood learns of what Rose did, everything takes a dangerous turn. Would they honor her last wish, or would their loyalty to the gang come first? And would Skull risk everything to keep his vow? Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. I have missed you all. Missed all the experiences we've had together. It's been a rough ride as we're currently battling some technical issues, but trust me, we're getting everything back and running. So stick around. I need your support on YouTube now more than ever. Thank you specially for sticking around to this very moment. If you're hooked in and you're ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now back to the story. The world outside was still, frozen in time. The coldest night of the year had arrived, and the snow fell like a soft blanket, covering the streets, the rooftops, and the trees in a shimmering layer of white. The wind howled through the small town, but inside the modest house on the edge of it, there was warmth. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a soft glow that danced across the walls. 7-year-old Rose Micheal sat by the window, her small frame wrapped in a faded blanket, staring out at the world that seemed so distant. She was delicate, her face pale, her body weak from the relentless battle with cancer. Her hands, once full of energy and life, now trembled with the weight of the illness. But there was a fire within her that didn't match the fragile body she was trapped in. Despite the frailty, she fought to stay strong, fought to keep her head above the water of pain and uncertainty. Her wide, brown eyes were filled with a quiet determination, as if she could will the world around her to be something else. The rhythmic hum of her grandmother's voice drifted to her ears, the old woman preparing dinner in the kitchen. The aroma of soup and bread filled the air, but Rose barely noticed. Her thoughts were lost in the vast expanse of the world outside the window. The storm raged on, blanketing the world in white, a thick veil that seemed to hide everything. But as Rose gazed out at the snow, something caught her eye. In the distance, she saw a shape. A figure, dark against the whiteness, barely visible through the blur of snowflakes. For a moment, she thought it might be a trick of her tired eyes, a product of the feverish haze that often lingered over her mind. But as she squinted, the figure grew clearer. A man. A large man. His form sprawled in the snow, unmoving. Rose hesitated. The cold seeped in through the edges of the window, and the thought of stepping out into the harsh weather made her heart race. But the hesitation didn't last long. Something inside her clicked, a spark of energy that surged through her despite the weakness in her limbs. With determination, she pushed herself up from the window and shuffled toward the door. Each step felt like a mountain, but she didn't stop. The urgency in her chest drove her forward. The door creaked open, and the cold air hit her like a wall. It made her gasp, but she didn't flinch. The world was quiet except for the sound of the storm, and the only movement was the swirling snowflakes that danced in the night air. Rose's breath came in shallow bursts, the coldness sinking into her chest as she stepped into the night, her eyes locked on the figure ahead. When she reached him, the sight nearly took her breath away. The man was big, his body nearly lost in the snow, his leather jacket a dark contrast against the white surroundings. She could see the skull and wings emblazoned on the back, the unmistakable symbol of the Hell's Angels. Her heart raced, and for a fleeting moment, fear gripped her. Hell's Angels. A gang. Dangerous people. But then, just as quickly, fear melted away, replaced by a fierce wave of empathy. Rose didn't see the symbol. She didn't see a biker or a threat. She saw a person in need, someone who, just like her, was fighting to survive. The snow piled higher around his body, and she could see his breath, shallow and uneven, as if life itself were slipping away from him. Her body ached with the effort, but she pushed through. She knelt beside him, her small hands trembling as she tried to move him. He was cold, impossibly cold, like a block of ice. She tugged and pulled, her hands slipping on his heavy leather jacket. He was too big for her to lift, too lifeless. But still, she kept trying. "Come on," she whispered to herself, willing her strength to return. You can do this. With a final desperate push, she managed to get his upper body up and into a sitting position. Then, with all the energy she had left, Rose dragged him, inch by inch, toward the warmth of her grandmother's house. The effort was excruciating, each movement sending waves of exhaustion through her small frame. Her breath came in ragged gasps, but she didn't stop. She refused to. Finally, with one last push, she got him inside. The door slammed shut behind them, cutting off the fury of the storm. The warmth of the house hit her immediately, but Rose barely felt it. She dropped to her knees, panting, her legs trembling with the strain. The man slumped against the wall, and she quickly covered him with the nearest blanket she could find, wrapping it tightly around his body. She could feel the frost on his skin, the chill that seeped into her own bones. Her hands, though cold and shaky, worked tirelessly. She rubbed his frostbitten hands, trying to bring some warmth back into them. The man stirred, a small groan escaping his lips as his eyes fluttered open. His pupils were dilated, his vision unfocused. But he saw her. A small girl, her face as pale as his own, her big brown eyes locked on him with a quiet, unshakable determination. For a moment, neither of them moved. He blinked, trying to process the situation, and then with great effort, he managed to speak. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice rough, barely audible. "I'm Rose," she whispered, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You're safe now." Despite the weight of his exhaustion, the hardness in his eyes softened for just a moment. He realized then that his life had been saved, not by force or violence, but by the kindness of a little girl. The fire in the hearth crackled, the warmth slowly filling the room, but Rose didn't feel it. She only felt the soft beating of her heart, steady and strong. She had done what she had to do. She had helped him. And now, with him safe, she could rest, knowing that she had made a difference. The darkness around him was thick, heavy, suffocating. Skull's mind spun in a haze of confusion, each thought coming in fragmented bursts. A sharp sting of pain pulsed through his chest, and as he tried to focus, his vision blurred even more. The world around him felt distant, unreal. His body, frozen and stiff, seemed foreign, disconnected from his mind. Then slowly, a new sensation crept in. The soft warmth of something. A hand? No, it was a gentle touch, like a whisper of warmth amidst the cold, pulling him back to life. Skull tried to open his eyes again, the movement slow, his eyelids heavy like lead. As he blinked against the fog that clouded his mind, the world around him started to come into focus. The first thing he noticed was the flickering light in the corner of the room. The fire crackled softly, its warmth filling the space around him. The storm outside was relentless, howling through the night, but inside this small house, the fire offered a refuge. Skull's thoughts moved like molasses, thick and sluggish, but his gaze shifted, struggling to make sense of his surroundings. And then he saw her. A little girl. Fragile and small, with eyes full of concern. She sat beside him, her hands gently wrapped around his frostbitten fingers, working to bring warmth back into his stiff, frozen skin. Skull blinked, trying to process what he was seeing, but his mind was still thick, struggling against the fog. The girl's face was soft, her eyes a deep brown that glinted with an innocence that made him pause. Her body, though small and frail, was full of purpose. She didn't seem afraid. She didn't look at him like he was a threat, like so many had before. Her presence, calm and unassuming, was like a balm to the chaos of his mind. The tenderness with which she treated him, so completely opposite to the rough world he had known for so long, left him momentarily speechless. Skull swallowed hard, his throat dry, but his voice came out as a weak rasp. Where am I?" The girl rose, as she introduced herself, didn't flinch at his rough, hoarse tone. Instead, she gave him a small, reassuring smile, her voice soft but clear. "You're safe. I found you outside in the snow. You were cold." She paused, her eyes flicking to his hands. "I didn't know what else to do but bring you inside and try to warm you." Skull's mind flickered back to the storm, the snow, and the motorcycle, how he'd ended up outside. His memories were fractured, his body too tired to keep up. But the one thing that stood out was this little girl, sitting beside him, offering warmth when she didn't even know him. He tried to lift his head, but his neck was stiff, and his body ached with cold, the chill still gnawing at him despite the blankets wrapped around him. Why would you help me?" His voice cracked with the effort, and for a moment, He wasn't sure if it was the cold or the realization that someone had cared for him in a way he hadn't felt in years. Rose, her small hand still tending to his, paused for a heartbeat. She looked at him with those wide, innocent eyes. "I didn't think. I just saw you and knew you needed help." Her words were simple, yet they held a weight that Skull had never expected to feel from a child. A weight that seemed to settle in his chest. Skull had known nothing but the brutal world of the road. Fights, violence, survival. He was a Hell's Angel, a veteran of countless battles and road wars. His life was built on rules of toughness, self-reliance, and never showing weakness. He had hardened himself against the world, against vulnerability. But here, in this quiet room, the tenderness this little girl showed him felt like a jolt to the system. For the first time in as long as he could remember, Skull felt something stirring inside him, something unfamiliar. He wasn't just the biker, the hardened man of the road. He wasn't in control here. This little girl, whose life was no less fragile than his own, had saved him. And in doing so, she'd cracked open a door inside him he hadn't known was there. "Why?" he repeated, the question now more of a whisper, as if speaking it aloud would help him understand it better. "Why would you help someone like me?" Rose, her hand still wrapped around his, glanced up at him with sincerity. "Because everyone deserves help. Even bikers. Even if they're part of the Hell's Angels." The mention of his gang didn't faze her. There was no fear in her voice, no hesitation. It was as if the label didn't matter. It was just him, a person who needed help. And for a brief moment, Skull felt like more than just a biker. He felt like a man, vulnerable and human, in need of care and kindness. As the fire crackled softly, Skull's mind began to clear. The pain in his chest, though still there, seemed more bearable now. The frostbite in his hands stung less. He could feel the warmth of Rose's hands, steady and kind, as they worked on bringing him back to life. But it wasn't just his body that was healing. Something deeper was shifting inside him, a realization that he couldn't outrun. The purity in this girl's kindness, the selflessness she showed despite her own battles, had reached him in a way nothing had in years. Skull had always seen himself as someone who needed nothing. But now, he was beginning to understand just how much he needed this. Needed this little girl's kindness. Needed this moment. As his thoughts began to clear, he turned his gaze back to her, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something shift within him, a connection, something that tied him to this child, to this moment. Something that could change the course of his life forever. The days that followed were a blur of quiet moments and slow healing. Skull's body was no longer stiff with cold, and the fire that Rose had carefully tended had worked its magic, both on his body and on his soul. The room that had once seemed cold and foreign now felt like a place of refuge. As the hours passed, Skull regained his strength, his mind clearing from the fog of exhaustion. But there was something else that was beginning to change, something inside him that he couldn't ignore. Rose sat beside him, her small form hunched slightly as she gazed out the window. Despite the warmth of the house, she still looked frail, as though every breath she took more effort than the last. But her eyes, they were filled with a quiet fire, a determination that made her seem much older than her 7 years. The silence between them was comfortable, but after a while, Rose's voice broke it. She spoke softly, almost as if she were sharing a secret with the world, not expecting anyone else to hear. "I've always wanted to ride a motorcycle," she said, her eyes still focused on the snowflakes falling outside. Her voice, though small, was filled with the kind of conviction that only a child could muster. "I want to feel the wind in my hair. I want to know what it's like to just go. To feel free." Skull listened intently, the sound of her words sinking into him like a weight he hadn't expected to carry. He had heard hundreds of stories from the road, stories of thrill, freedom, and danger, all wrapped into one. He had seen men and women ride with abandon, their faces full of excitement and courage. But hearing it from this little girl, knowing how little time she had left, struck a chord in him that he hadn't realized was there. "I've never been on a bike," Rose continued, her voice soft but filled with longing. "But I always wanted to. Just once. Before it's too late." Her words hung in the air, the heaviness of them settling into the room. Skull looked over at her, his mind racing as he took in what she had said. She was too weak to ride on her own, her body too frail to handle the strain of a bike. The very thought of it seemed impossible. Yet, here she was, clinging to a dream. A simple, pure wish that, in the face of everything she was enduring, still burned bright. The air in the room felt thick with emotion. Rose's illness, so painfully evident in her appearance, contrasted sharply with the boldness of her dream. She wasn't asking for grand things. She wasn't asking for fame or riches or anything most people would covet. All she wanted was the freedom of a ride, the wind in her hair, the feeling of a moment where nothing else mattered. Skull's heart tightened in his chest. He knew what it was like to be in the grip of something larger than yourself. He knew the feeling of being trapped, whether it was by the weight of his past or the code he lived by. But Rose? She wasn't trapped. She still had dreams. And that made him feel something he hadn't felt in years. Rose, his voice was rough, thick with emotion. He cleared his throat, trying to steady himself. I promise you, he said, his voice firm now, filled with a sense of resolve he hadn't expected. I'll take you for that ride. I'll make sure you feel the wind in your hair. You'll have that freedom. I swear it. Rose turned to him, her eyes wide and filled with the kind of hope that only a child could possess. A smile, fragile but real, spread across her face. It was a small smile, but it was enough to shake him to his core. For a moment, she looked like she might say something more, but instead, she simply nodded. Her breath seemed to steady, as though a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Skull's heart thudded in his chest. He had made a promise, one that, in his world, was as sacred as anything could be. He didn't know how he was going to do it, or what it would take, but one thing was certain, he would fulfill this promise. No matter the cost. As Rose lay back against the pillows, closing her eyes for a moment's rest, Skull sat in silence. His mind raced, 1,000 thoughts rushing through him. His life had been filled with the chaos of the road, the adrenaline, the constant battles. He was a biker, a Hell's Angel. His world was full of rough men, violence, and rebellion. He was the last person who should be moved by something like this. But here he was, touched by the innocence of a child, by her purity and her unrelenting spirit. This little girl, despite everything she had been through, still had a dream. She still had hope. And he? He had spent so much of his life hardened, closed off from any real emotions, that he hadn't realized how much he needed something like this. Something pure. Something that wasn't just about survival. Skull looked at Rose, lying there so peacefully, and a quiet resolve settled over him. He couldn't explain it, but he knew in that moment that he was going to do whatever it took. No matter the danger. No matter the cost. He would give her this moment. Her dream would become a reality. As the wind howled outside, Skull sat there in silence, lost in his thoughts. His promise was made, but he wasn't just keeping it for Rose. He was keeping it for himself, too. For the man he used to be, and the man he was beginning to realize he could still be. The roar of the engines had faded as Skull rode away from Rose's house. The winds had stilled. The road stretched out before him, yet his mind was anything but clear. He had made a promise to her, one that felt as heavy as any battle he'd ever fought. A promise that would test the boundaries of what he thought he knew about Brotherhood. Now, Skull stood inside the dimly lit clubhouse, surrounded by the familiar faces of the Hell's Angels. The smell of stale smoke and beer hung in the air, but today, something felt different. There was a tension, an undercurrent that ran deeper than the usual camaraderie. Skull's brothers, those men who had ridden alongside him through thick and thin, were listening to him, but they were waiting. Waiting for him to explain what had just happened, what he was asking of them. He stood at the front of the room, his back straight but his voice wavering. His hands, still stiff from the cold, clenched at his sides. He had seen countless things on the road, violence, chaos, the gritty reality of life. But now, here he was, about to ask something none of them had ever expected. Her name's Rose, he began, his voice rough with emotion. She's just a kid. 7 years old. And she saved my life. The room was quiet. The usual hum of the clubhouse, jokes, chatter and clinking glasses, had been replaced by a heavy silence. Skull could feel the eyes of his brothers on him, the judgment, the skepticism, and somewhere beneath it, the curiosity. He took a deep breath and continued, his gaze falling to the floor for a moment. She's dying. Cancer. She doesn't have much time left. But she had one wish. One thing she wanted to do before it was too late. Skull's throat tightened as he relived that moment in Rose's room, the look in her eyes as she spoke of her dream, the fragile hope in her voice. He had promised her, and now, standing here in front of his brothers, that promise felt heavier than ever. She wanted to ride, he said quietly. Just once before she goes. She wanted to feel the wind in her hair, like she's free, even if it's just for a little while. He paused, looking up at the men in front of him. I told her I would take her. I'm going to make her wish come true. The silence in the room deepened. Some of the men exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. Skull knew them well. These were the guys who had lived through blood, sweat, and tears. The ones who had fought alongside him, the ones who had lived by the code of the road. They were hard, unforgiving, their lives built on a foundation of strength and loyalty. They didn't do charity. They didn't do softness. But Rose had reached through all that, had cracked open something in Skull he didn't even know was there. Skull, came the gruff voice of Hawk, one of the oldest members. His face was weathered, his hands shaking slightly as he leaned forward. I get it, brother. I really do. But you're asking us to do something we've never done before. Help a kid? A kid who ain't even one of us? We're not a charity. We don't go handing out favors like this. The tension in the room was palpable. Skull could feel the weight of Hawk's words like a physical blow. He had expected this. He knew it wouldn't be easy to ask for their help. The Hell's Angels weren't a group that did good deeds just because it was the right thing to do. They were a family, but they weren't soft. I know it sounds crazy, Skull replied, his voice steadying. I know it doesn't make sense. But I can't stop thinking about her. She's not just a little girl with a dream. She's a symbol of something we've lost somewhere along the way. We're so used to fighting, to surviving, we've forgotten that kindness, real raw kindness, matters. And I'm asking you, as my brothers, to do the one thing that's going to mean something in this world. To show that we stand for something more than just our reputation. The room remained still. Skull's words hung in the air, the weight of them pressing down on everyone present. The men who had fought side by side with him, who had seen everything from the inside of prison cells to the blood-soaked roads, were now faced with a question they hadn't prepared for. Do we honor a dying kid's last wish? Skull's voice dropped to a whisper. Or do we turn our backs on something that could make us more than what we've been? Hawk shifted in his seat, clearly torn. Then slowly, something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of understanding. Skull wasn't just asking for a favor. He was asking them to look at themselves differently. To be part of something that mattered beyond their world of leather jackets and skulls. Hell, Hawk muttered, leaning back in his chair. You're right. We're not a charity. But we are a brotherhood. And I'll be damned if I'm gonna let a little girl down just because she ain't one of us. One by one, the room began to shift. Razor, the younger member who had always kept to himself, nodded slowly. I'll ride with you, Skull. I get it. It's not just about her. It's about showing that we're more than the sum of our scars. The room fell silent once more, but this time, the silence was different. It wasn't one of doubt, it was one of unity, of understanding. Slowly, one by one, the men in the room stood, their faces hard but resolute. The decision was made. We'll ride, Hawk said, standing up to face Skull. For her. If you believe acts of kindness can change the world, hit that like button. Imagine being in Skull's shoes. Would you honor a dying child's wish, no matter the cost? Leave your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done? The morning light struggled through the thick clouds, casting an ethereal glow over the small house that had become a symbol of hope for so many. The snow had stopped falling, but the chill in the air still held on, reminding everyone that it was the coldest time of year. But today was different. Today there was warmth, a warmth that radiated from the gathered group outside, from the love and respect they were about to show for a little girl with a dream. The ground outside Rose's grandmother's house had been cleared, making way for the thousands of motorcycles now lined up in a row. The engines hummed in unison, a steady roar that vibrated through the ground. The sounds of leather jackets and roaring bikes created a symphony of unity, a symbol of solidarity for one small frail girl who had dreamed of feeling the wind in her hair before time ran out. Inside, Rose sat on the couch, dressed in a warm jacket and a helmet that looked too large for her tiny frame. She was weak, her skin pale, but her eyes were filled with an excitement that had been absent for so long. This was her moment. She had never expected to feel something like this, not after everything she had endured. But today, as she gazed out the window at the sea of bikers gathered outside, she felt alive. Truly alive. Skull stood by the door, watching Rose carefully as she adjusted her helmet. His heart ached with both pride and sorrow. He had promised her this ride, and nothing, absolutely nothing, was going to stop him from keeping that promise. The Brotherhood of Hell's Angels had rallied around her, their support unwavering, and now they were all standing at attention, ready to honor her dream. Skull had lived his life on the edge, but this moment, this ride, was something different. It wasn't about power or speed or dominance. It was about giving a little girl her final wish. It was about showing the world that even in the harshest of times, kindness could still win. Ready? Skull asked softly, his voice rough but gentle as he kneeled beside her. Rose turned to him, her eyes wide with excitement. Ready? Skull gave her a reassuring smile, though his own heart was pounding in his chest. He could see the tremor in her hands, but it didn't matter. This was her dream. She had fought for so long, and today, she was going to live that dream, even if it was only for a brief moment. Skull gently lifted her, making sure she was steady in front of him on the motorcycle. The rest of the bikers formed a protective circle around her, standing tall in their leather jackets, their faces solemn yet filled with quiet respect. As Skull revved the engine, the roar of the bikes around them seemed to grow louder, the energy in the air electrifying. The anticipation was almost too much to bear, but Rose didn't flinch. She was too focused on the one thing she had dreamed of for so long. The engines roared to life, and the ground beneath them seemed to shake with the power of the machines. Rose's small hands gripped the sides of the bike, and for the first time in a long time, she felt something other than the ache of illness. She felt joy. Pure, unadulterated joy. Her face, usually pale and worn from her battle with cancer, was now alive with a light that made her glow. Skull's eyes flicked to the road ahead, but his focus was entirely on the girl in front of him. He could feel her excitement, her joy, radiating through him. This was the moment he had promised her, and nothing else mattered. The motorcycles in the circle around them began to roll forward, their engines vibrating in sync with each other. The streets of the town stretched out before them, the world around them quiet except for the sound of roaring engines and the wind picking up. The cold air brushed against Rose's face, but it didn't matter. She was free. She was finally experiencing the freedom she had dreamed of, the wind in her hair, the world stretching out before her. It was everything she had imagined, and more. As they sped through the streets, Skull could feel Rose's excitement. Her smile was wide, her eyes sparkling with a happiness that no one had seen in her for so long. The other bikers rode alongside them, forming a shield of solidarity. They weren't just fulfilling a promise. They were honoring a life that had given them something they had forgotten: hope. The circle of bikes surrounding Rose felt like a shield of protection, keeping her safe, allowing her to feel the freedom she had always longed for. The wind howled in Rose's ears, but it was the sound of freedom. It wasn't the harsh, cold wind that had almost taken her life. No, this was different. This was the wind of possibilities, of dreams fulfilled, of a wish that had been granted. For the first time in her life, Rose felt the full weight of what it meant to be alive. She wasn't just a sick little girl anymore. She wasn't just fighting for survival. She was living, truly living, in this moment. The road stretched ahead of her like an endless adventure, the wind rushing past her, and for that single precious moment, everything was perfect. The bikes roared around her, their engines a symphony of strength and unity. Rose's smile never wavered as she leaned into Skull, her tiny body swaying with the rhythm of the ride. It was everything she had ever dreamed of: freedom, adventure, joy. And it was hers. All hers. Rose's wish was simple, yet powerful. Do you think acts of kindness should always be honored? Would you have taken this ride for Rose? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's remember her bravery together. The sun had set, painting the sky with soft hues of purple and orange as the final echoes of the roaring engines faded into the distance. Rose's ride had been everything she had dreamed of and more. The wind in her hair, the thrill of the open road, the freedom she had longed for, it had all been fulfilled. But now, the storm inside her body, the battle with cancer that she had fought for so long, was coming to a close. Rose sat on the porch of her grandmother's house, her small frame propped up with the help of pillows. She was surrounded by the men and women of the Hell's Angels, her protectors, her brothers and sisters, the ones who had made her dream come true. Their leather jackets were worn, their faces weathered with the struggles of their own lives, but today, they stood in reverence. They were not just bikers, they were a family that had come together to give a little girl something more than just a ride. They had given her a moment of peace, a moment of freedom. Skull knelt beside her, his strong calloused hand gently holding hers. His eyes were red-rimmed, his jaw clenched tightly. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to become so connected to this little girl, whose bravery had cracked open a part of his heart that he thought had been sealed shut forever. Now, as he held her hand, he could feel the weight of her final moments pressing against him. His mind flashed back to that first moment when he had found her, small and frail but full of life, full of hope. And now, that hope was slipping away, as quietly as the night itself. Rose's eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at him, her gaze soft, as if she had always known that this moment was coming. But there was no fear in her eyes. There was only peace. "I feel it, Skull," she whispered, her voice faint, almost like a dream. "I feel the wind still, like I'm still riding." Skull swallowed hard, fighting to keep his emotions in check. He squeezed her hand, his rough fingers brushing against her delicate skin. He couldn't bring himself to speak. The lump in his throat was too large, too painful. But Rose didn't need words. She had already said everything she needed to say with that simple, pure smile, the smile that had started it all. Around them, the bikers stood in silence. Their engines, once roaring with defiance and power, were now silent, as if even the machines themselves respected the moment. Some of them stood with their heads bowed, others with their arms crossed, but all of them shared the same feeling, a deep sense of reverence for the little girl who had changed their lives. Skull gently leaned down, brushing a lock of hair from Rose's forehead. His voice, when it came, was thick with emotion. "You did it, Rose," he said softly. "You lived. You rode. And you changed all of us. I promise you. I'll never forget." Rose's eyes fluttered, her lips curling into a small smile. I know, she whispered. Her voice was barely a breath now, but it carried the weight of a lifetime of hope, of dreams fulfilled, of a life lived fully, even in its short time. As Skull sat there, holding her hand, he felt the weight of everything that had happened. The biker who had once been so hardened, so unfeeling, was now a man who understood the value of kindness, the power of a simple promise. Rose had taught him more than he could ever put into words. She had shown him what it meant to live with courage, to face the hardest of battles with a smile, and to never give up on the things that truly matter. Rose's breath slowed, her tiny body frail against the weight of the blankets. Skull stayed by her side, never letting go of her hand, as the rest of the bikers stood in a quiet circle around them. They weren't just bikers anymore, they were family, bound together by the shared understanding that kindness, selflessness, and love had the power to change everything, even in the toughest of worlds. As Skull whispered his final goodbyes to Rose, the room fell into an almost sacred silence. The night air was still, save for the occasional rustling of leaves. The fire inside the house flickered, casting a soft glow across the room, but it was nothing compared to the light that Rose had brought into the lives of everyone around her. And then, just like that, Rose's breath came to a gentle stop. Her hand, once warm in Skull's grasp, grew cold. Her body, once filled with energy and dreams, stilled. But her spirit? Her spirit would live on in the hearts of the Hell's Angels who had made her wish come true. She had touched their lives in a way that no one else ever could. Skull, kneeling beside her, took a deep, shuddering breath. For a moment, he felt lost, unsure of how to move forward without the little girl who had shown him what it truly meant to be human. But then he felt it, the slightest whisper of wind in the room, a breeze that seemed to carry with it Rose's smile, her laughter, her courage. The bikers, one by one, lowered their heads in respect. They had come together to honor her life, and now they would carry her memory with them, forever. Skull stood up, gently placing Rose's hand down on the blanket, his heart heavy but full of gratitude. She had shown them what mattered. She had shown them that even in the toughest of times, kindness had the power to change everything. As Skull turned to face the others, his voice was low, but steady. "We'll never forget her. We'll never forget what she taught us." And as they stood together, Skull knew that the bond they shared with Rose would live on, long after her final breath. It would live on in every ride, every act of kindness, every moment they chose to stand together as a family. The Hell's Angels had honored her wish. Now, they would honor her memory. And in doing so, they would never be the same. The road stretched out before Skull like an endless ribbon, the asphalt gleaming under the soft light of the morning sun. The sound of his bike's engine was the only noise that filled the air, its deep rumble echoing in the stillness around him. The wind, once harsh and biting, now felt different against his skin. It was gentler, as if the world had softened since that day, the day they had fulfilled Rose's final wish. Skull's mind was miles away from the physical road. His thoughts, though distant, always returned to her, the little girl who had brought more than just a dream to life. She had shown him, and the entire Brotherhood, what it meant to truly live with kindness, with vulnerability. Rose had taught them something no one could have predicted. And now, as Skull rode alone, the weight of her memory settled deep within him. The Hell's Angels, once feared and respected for their strength, their rebelliousness, their defiance, had changed, at least in the ways that truly mattered. They had always been a family, bound together by the road, by their loyalty to each other. But Rose's story, her courage, her wish, had cracked open something in them, something they had forgotten along the way. They had seen how a simple act of kindness, a promise kept, could transcend everything they thought they stood for. Skull let his mind wander back to those final moments with Rose. The ride had been everything she had dreamed of, but there was more to it than that. Her smile, her laughter, the joy she had felt on that motorcycle, it had become a symbol for something much greater. It wasn't just about a ride, it was about living fully, embracing every moment, even when the world around you was crumbling. Rose had been more than just a little girl who wanted to feel the wind on her face. She had been a teacher, an inspiration. He smiled to himself as he remembered her small, fragile body on the bike, clinging to him, her face lit up with a joy so pure it made everything else fade away. She had taken that ride, and with it, she had stolen a piece of their hearts. Even now, miles down the road, Skull felt that smile in his chest. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the empty road. He slowed his bike, letting the wind rush past him, cooling the sweat that had started to bead on his forehead. The air felt lighter than it ever had before. He had always thought the road was where he belonged, the rumble of his bike and the roar of the engines filling the void in his life. But now, it was different. The road didn't just feel like a place to escape anymore. It felt like a place to remember. He thought about his brothers, his fellow Hell's Angels, how they had stood beside him, side by side, as they honored Rose's wish. He thought about how they had changed in that moment. They had always been a tough group, living by their own rules, taking what they wanted from the world. But now, they were different. Rose's bravery had seeped into their bones, had softened the edges of their hardened hearts. They had given her something they didn't often give to anyone, their respect, their loyalty, and their undivided attention. The thought of that made Skull's chest swell with pride. These men, who had seen and done it all, had stood for something bigger than themselves. They had stood for kindness. They had stood for the pure innocence that Rose represented. It wasn't just about a final wish, it was about showing the world that, despite everything they had endured, they could still be something good. The ride, the promise, the fulfillment of Rose's dream, it had forever changed the Hell's Angels. Skull could see it in the way they looked at each other now, the unspoken bond between them stronger than before. They had all been through hell together, but it was this act of kindness, this simple, selfless moment, that had solidified their place in the world. As Skull rounded a bend in the road, the world around him seemed to open up. The horizon stretched out before him, vast and endless. It was a sight that had always filled him with a sense of freedom, but today, it felt different. It felt like the world was full of possibility. He had always lived by the road, always thought that was where he was meant to be. But now, as the wind brushed against his face, he realized that the road was just the beginning. Rose's story wasn't over. Her bravery, her kindness, it would live on in the hearts of everyone who had known her. And that legacy would continue to shape the Brotherhood, the Hell's Angels, in ways they hadn't yet fully understood. Skull knew he wouldn't be the same. None of them would. They had all been marked by her, by the purity of her wish and the strength with which she had carried it to the end. He slowed his bike as he reached the top of a hill, looking out at the vast landscape before him. The road stretched on forever, and in that moment, he knew there was no end to the journey. Rose had shown him that. She had shown him that kindness, love, and loyalty were more than just words. They were actions, actions that could change the world, actions that could save lives, just as they had saved him. With a deep breath, Skull revved the engine again and set his sights on the road ahead. The road was still long, still full of miles yet to be traveled. But for the first time in a long time, Skull knew he wasn't just writing for survival anymore. He was writing for something greater, for Rose, for his brothers, and for the legacy of kindness that would continue long after the engines fell silent. If you believe that acts of kindness, no matter how small, can change the world, hit that like button and share this story. What would you have done if you were in Skull's shoes? Would you have honored Rose's final wish? Drop a comment below and let us know how you would have handled this powerful moment. Let's keep her legacy of kindness alive together. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.